Democracy That Delivers is brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. Now to your host.
Hello, and welcome to CIPE's Democracy That Delivers podcast. My name is Adam Sachs. I'm a program officer with the Global Programs Department. With Indonesia hosting the G20 summit just last month, the world turned its attention to the Southeast Asian nation of Indonesia as global leaders convened in Bali, Indonesia from November 15th and 16th to discuss significant global challenges such as constrained growth, rising inflation, disruptions to global supply chains, energy and food insecurity, and of course, the war in Ukraine. Among these challenges is digital governance, or rather, how should we shape policies to create more inclusive, enabling, and safe digital environments? Much ink has been used to describe the outcomes from the G20, but today I wanted to bring more attention to the role of the Think 20 or T20, an official engagement group of the G20, and how the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies, or CIPS, contributed to the T20 process, which held its own summit in September. Today, I am pleased to have Rainer Heufers, the Executive Director of CIPS, to share how his think tank provided policy analysis and fostered greater local stakeholder engagement in the many months prior to the G20 summit. It is my pleasure to welcome Rainer to our podcast. Rainer, how are you today?
I'm very good. Thank you, Adam. And thank you for having me here on this podcast. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, we're certainly excited to learn more from you. And that's just wonderful to hear. So to begin, for those who are unfamiliar with the G20 and its official engagement groups, what are they and how do they interact or complement each other?
Yeah, it's an important point, Adam, because many people know the G20 as a meeting of presidents and head of states of basically 19 countries plus the European Union. It looks like a big show in one massive venue, but there's so much more to it. And as you rightfully say, it is the so-called official engagement groups. Now, what is that? The official engagement groups cover almost all aspects of governance. So we have, for example, a youth 20 that would talk about policies and governance from a youth perspective. We have civil society, that's the C20, doing the same just from civil society perspective. There is the SAI 20, which is the state audit institutions, Supreme Audit Institution 20, that talks about auditing state accounts, etc. and so forth. So there are so many different engagement groups. And as you already mentioned, there's also an engagement group of global think tanks, and that is the T20 or the Think 20. Now, what does that mean when we say engagement group? They are officially recognized groups by the G20 who are invited to actually prepare their analysis and their proposals for the G20 leaders and the G20 process. So when we talk about the T20, it means that global think tanks get together to prepare policy proposals that will later then be published and also summarized in a policy communique, which is then passed to the G20 leaders.
Wow, fascinating. And thank you so much for that explanation. I don't think everyone really appreciates the extent that the private sector, civil society, and think tanks like CIPS serve in providing thoughtful analysis and perspectives for the G20. It almost sounds like this is a little niche to kind of get into this area. So to that end, can you please tell us a bit about CIPS and how did CIPS get involved with the T20?
Oh, yeah, sure. No, I mean, you're absolutely right, Adam. It is indeed, when you hear about it, you think, wow, that's our moment. Let's make sure our voice is heard. And I mean, we have that so many times, right? As think tanks or NGOs, we want to be heard. You need to find the venue, you need to find the channel to be heard. Here is a channel where you can get heard. You can use that T20. If you are a think tank, you can use so many other channels to make sure whatever analysis you have, you can try to get into the conversation. So us as a think tank, we do know the main other think tanks in the country. So there is fair amount of opportunities where we can meet and exchange ideas about policies, but also just about think tank issues. And so I am in touch also with the executive director of the think tank that is the main host of the T20. So need to explain. We usually, in the T20 process, there are usually either one or quite often actually two think tanks in the country, which are the general host of the whole T20. And then under that, there will be task forces. I can explain a bit about that later. But so we have these hosts, and Indonesia as well had two think tank hosts, and I knew one of them quite well. And when the process started, I thought I better speak to them and say, listen, we have our special expertise in certain policy areas. How about CIPS can come in as a host of one of those task forces? And it is quite a complicated process, which is also quite supervised in a way by the government. At least the government wants to know who is in these official engagement groups, etc. So it's quite a bit of a negotiation going on. But in the end, we were confirmed as the host of the Task Force on Agriculture and Food Security, where we have a special expertise besides the digital economy issues that Adam, you and I want to talk about a bit later. But yeah, so we had that special expertise. We were seen as a reliable think tank partner, and therefore we were able to get this opportunity to host that task force in the process.
Wow, such an incredible achievement. And I mean, can you share a bit more about what that role entails?
Sure, absolutely. I had the same question at the beginning. I mean, I knew there were hosts to be selected, but yeah, exactly. What does that mean? What are we signing up to if we become a host? Now, that's when CIPE came in, because you and your network had excellent contacts to countries that had already hosted the G20 in the past. So it was immensely helpful when you connected us to the friends in CIPEC, which is a think tank in Argentina, which had hosted the T20 when the G20 was in Buenos Aires. And so we had a good chance to speak to them and to find out what it actually means. Now, let me summarize basically what we learned and what we later had to also put into practice. The process is as such. It starts about a year before. So Indonesia just handed over the T20 and the G20 to India. That means now all the Indian groups are getting busy. We did the same thing. We also started to get busy in about November, December last year, in 2021. What happened first is you need to, so the T20 has as many task forces as the G20 has typically. So if the G20 is organized in 9 working groups, let's say one deals with the digital economy, another one with health, another one maybe with finance, etc. The T20 would try to mirror those working groups of the government by task forces of the T20. And so we had 9 task forces. And the first thing that you need to do within the task force is you need to find your own co-chairs. So who are the expert leaders who lead the task force? That's your first job. And that's also really something where we got advice and help from that Argentinian think tank. What does that mean? What you need to consider? You want to have representation from different continents among these co-chairs. You want to have very experienced people from academia, maybe from business, from government. You want gender equality if you can. You have to consider quite a lot of things. And in the end, our task force had 9 co-chairs. The lead co-chair from Indonesia. Another co-chair is a board member of CIPS, so 2 Indonesians, and the rest were from other countries, other continents. For example, the chief economist of FAO was one of our co-chairs, an expert on maritime affairs and fisheries from New Zealand. So we had different experts among these co-chairs. That's your first task. Get the group of experts together, because they will be the ones ensuring quality of your policy proposals to the G20. That's when that is done, the next task that's coming your way is to invite policy papers. All of this is done by the task forces. And you must also understand that T20 is a non-governmental engagement group. There is no money per se for that. So every task force would try to raise some money so that we are able to actually host all these conversations, later also events, make sure there's a certain secretariat, etc. So all of this relies on fundraising efforts of all task forces. So CIPS had to do the same thing, make sure there is some money to actually oil the system. So once we had the 9 global co-chairs for our task force, then we started inviting policy paper proposals. So we were saying, please submit your suggestions for policy papers. And then you need to be very good in spreading the word so that people know that is a call for papers. No money involved. This is all organizations just basically doing it because they really want to join the global dialogue. And you need to spread the word and then wait for policy papers, or rather proposals, to come in, a few hundred words first. And then the global co-chairs will actually make the selection. That's a very difficult selection. So we got, if I'm not mistaken, slightly over 100 proposals just for our task force. I think for the entire T20, it must have been roughly 800 proposed papers that came in. And the other task forces had the same job to do. So they got, on average, roughly 90 to 100 per task force. And they needed to then see which one fits the G20 process, because sometimes the policy papers that are being suggested are very local, very specialized, but obviously this is a global dialogue. So we can't talk about the problems in one province of one country. That wouldn't work unless that issue has some relevance for the global discussion. So here we go. You need to go through all those papers, see what's possible. Sometimes 2 authors from different countries have the same suggestion, so then we merge those papers. It's a long process. Authors are also sometimes quite particular that they want to stick to their topic. We need to persuade them. In the end, in our task force, I think we had about 14 papers that were actually accepted and were worked on. And then once you have those papers decided, you inform the authors, and then the global co-chairs in our task force start working with the authors of these papers on producing the content. And when that is all done, we have 14 papers that can be published on the T20 website, and they will then be summarized in a communique that is being submitted to the G20 leaders. I'll stop here, but there's more. And that's the events side of things, So maybe, Adam, maybe you have a question or a comment first before I continue.
Yes, of course. And I mean, wow, it just sounds like an incredible opportunity to really gather global perspectives, learn from all of these different individuals on a particular topic, and really get the pulse of the issue itself. And you yourself, or CHIPS, was able to include 2 policy briefs for the consideration of G20's communique. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about those papers?
Yeah, sure. So since we are having that special expertise in food security and agriculture, we also submitted a proposal for a paper in that area. But then on the other hand, we have the expertise in digital economy. So in that area, we also submitted one. We submitted more, but like anyone else, many proposals get rejected when the experts are saying this doesn't really work or this is not really relevant for the G20. But those 2 were accepted. One of them in agriculture deals with the point that many agricultural subsidies are not really helping the farmers and might even be counterproductive, send the wrong incentives, support agricultural production methods that might not be sustainable, etc. But what is really needed, and what is in many countries not really well funded, is an R&D system in agriculture where we got innovations, new methods, new technologies. And so our paper suggests to do some concerted efforts in the world, possibly led by the G20, to repurpose those subsidies in order to support R&D and funding innovations in agriculture. That's one paper that was accepted, and we turned it into a full policy paper that is now published on the T20 website from Indonesia. The other paper is in the area of the digital economy. And we have a long history of also working with CIPE in the area of digital economy, the great partnership that we have there. I'm very grateful, Adam, for many years that we have now collaborated in this topic. This particular policy paper deals with the question of cross-border data flows. We have Indonesia as a relatively strong digital economy, quite a large and growing business area where that produces anything from starting from ride-hailing apps into now deliveries, into fintech solutions, medtech solutions, e-tech solutions, etc. So it's an enormously important sector that actually provides lots of opportunities to also low-income households to benefit. Now, this comes with lots and lots of regulatory challenges, and one of them is cross-border data flows. Will the government allow data to be stored abroad, or should it be stored in Indonesia? How do we standardize the data flows if an e-payment app that is developed in Indonesia can be used in Singapore, in a neighboring country? That means there needs to be a certain level of standardization. So there are various obstacles to cross-border data flows. And so the question was, how do we deal with this? And our policy proposal, our policy paper, focuses on the types of data. You cannot just talk about data. Data is too broad. There are different types of data. And you need to have a very detailed analysis. What are the data that we're talking about? Which ones are more sensitive and need to be protected? Which ones are less sensitive and may be shared? Where should government have access? Where should government allow storage of data abroad? So we basically argued for a very, very differentiated analysis of this, but also try to say to the government, keep the data flow open. We have a globally more and more integrated economy, and the digital economy is a very important one for that. It's a pioneering sector. So stopping data from crossing borders really does not help emerging economies, and it doesn't help emerging businesses to really spread to other countries. Other countries, yes.
Yeah. And thank you so much for that. And I mean, it really is fascinating to read the paper, and we will certainly add a link to that paper on this podcast.
Thank you.
But it just seems like such an expansive topic, and there's so many different views and perspectives throughout it all. I mean, what was the reception like to the policy paper?
We have, in general, very good response to this, and maybe that brings me back to an aspect I said earlier. I want to mention later in the conversation. You can't just publish a paper and put it on a website. I mean, you can, of course, then measure the downloads and these things, but what is much more important is that you make it part of the broader conversation, and that's where we need events, and that, as the host of a task force, is also very much your job. So you need to organize as many events as you can for two different audiences. One audience is the global one, where you want to have a global conversation. We did roundtables, regional roundtables on digital economy issues. We had international experts speaking our events. So this is basically to continue the global discussion in event format. On the other hand, you also want to persuade the Indonesian audiences that this is an important process. And that's, in Indonesia at least, need to happen in a local language. And then we need to localize these issues. So we need to move away from the global nature of the problems more to how does that affect our country here in Indonesia. So you need to do two types of events, or rather events with two types of audiences. And yeah, that's another one of the roles of a host. So you need to be aware of that. I don't know how many events we did, but I think it was 12 or 14 events that we ran as just a host of the Taskforce for Food Security and Agriculture. But besides this, CIPS has always had, or at least for a long time, a focus on the digital economy. So this policy paper was also made part of our conversations in the other events that we do anyway, that were outside, so to speak, of the T20 process, where we would talk about data flow, talk about digital infrastructure, we talking about data privacy, online consumer protection, etc.
Wow. Well, I mean, that sounds quite daunting, kind of having those parallel tracks of the global and local. But as you mentioned, I mean, it is extremely important to ensure that there is inclusion and participation from all local stakeholders and global stakeholders. Um, Pivoting a little bit over to the T20 summit, maybe you can mention, some of the outcomes from that summit, particularly related around anything related to the digital governance side of things. And then if anything really transferred over into the G20 and potentially the final communique that you saw, from this year-long process, did it actually make it in, or what was that like?
Yeah. Yeah, the T20 summit is really where it all culminates, and we have, of course, then high-level interaction between the global think tanks, the Indonesian think tanks, government officials, businesses. It's a big show that where we highlight main papers, results, discussion points that were elaborated. I mean, just think about it. It's a whole year of intense collaboration where we are coordinating between think tanks with other players, but we also coordinate with the working groups of the G20 process regularly. So there is an enormous amount of communication happening. More towards the end of this process, you would have a very hard time to be able to speak to any government representative because everybody is busy with G20. There's so many events. We are just one task force. You have 8 other T20 task forces. You have the Business 20, the B20, huge effort, and you have various other engagement groups that run their own events. So it's I don't know. It's kind of like a merry-go-round, or is a fun fair of the civil society where everybody is so busy organizing events on all sorts of topics on a level that I've never seen before. And Indonesia is a lively um, has a lively civil society. There is a lively discourse, but this took it to another level. And so and then this all ends with this T20 summit. There was also a youth summit, there was a business summit, and so on. It was also lots of summits. And important people fly in, important experts come. And for a country like Indonesia, it's a huge country. It's 270 million people. It's the fourth largest country in the world. It's pretty much inward looking. So Indonesia isn't your typical player on the global scene. I bet people listening to this podcast will will know Indonesia only for a limited number of reasons, which could relate to natural disasters, usually, unfortunately, or maybe tourism reasons. But other than that, Indonesia isn't very much on the national stage because it's very inward looking. To have these kind of global events and discussions is a new thing for the country. They're not used to this really. Also, there's a lack of English language skills that also stand as a barrier for that. Now, that's what I see as a massive impact. This 1 year of collaboration, that for me is the biggest impact. And then these summits, including the T20 summit, which was used for many other side events by many organizations. It was a massive show of strength of the think tanks, and it was very encouraging to see it happening. And yeah, CIPS was also, of course, represented there.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're glad that you were part of that show and part of that merry-go-round. It sounds like it was a rewarding ride around that merry-go-round. Um, and, seeing how, this is kind of, Indonesia's term has now ended. You mentioned it goes on to India now, but, CHIPS is still there working on this policy analysis in food security and digital governance. And just where does CHIPS go from here?
Um, it was for us, it was a catalyst of growth. We have been exposed to entirely new audiences because of this experience. I should also say that when I mentioned CIPEC in Argentina, they're far bigger than CHIPS is. I mean, CHIPS has now 25 staff members, but most other think tanks involved in this would have 50, 75 staff members. So we were really relatively small. So we had to stretch quite far to actually be able to pull this all off. But it was then very rewarding because many new organizations got to know who we are. Now we have far more organizations reaching out to us, asking for our partnership, our comments. So we are now far more firmly established in certain networks, in certain circles where we were not before. CIPS has very clear strategic objectives. So we're not changing the discourse that we're trying to influence. That stays the same. We're working on food security and agriculture. We're working on digital economy and economic opportunities. And we're working on education policies. So this is not affected. But we are able to work more intensively. To a certain extent, we also have more government outreach because of this, because they got to know it in a better way. So I would say, yeah, it's more of the same, but actually more intense than before. And I can only recommend for any think tank to, if you can, you jump on this opportunity. It's hard work, that's for sure. It's very hard work for a year, but it is rewarding if you do so. And then we also need to keep in mind, we always talk about giving marginalized groups a voice. And we're also in that context saying we want the global South to have a voice. But now we have Indonesia as a G20 in 2022. Next year is India. After that is Brazil. After that is South Africa. So now the G20 roadshow, if you want, stays entirely in the South for a couple of years. That gives Indonesian think tanks, this year it was Indonesian think tanks with a chance. But next year is India, then Brazil, South Africa. They all have a chance to really address the topics that matter for them. Last year it was Italy. In Italy, they wouldn't discuss food security. That was not on the agenda for them, but we took it. I mean, not we, but I mean, the entire G20 and T20 efforts brought it on the agenda of the discussions because it matters to Indonesia. So this way we can address problems that matter in the global South. And I do believe that is also something that should motivate us to get engaged.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's wonderful to hear that, in the next couple of years, it will be there in the global South. And you did mention a little bit, if people are interested, get more involved, right? But do you have any recommendations on how, these sorts of think tanks or business associations, chambers of commerce, civil society might be able to get involved in that G20 process?
There are different ways. I mean, first of all, of course, if you are located in the G20 country, you should make sure you are in the networks so that you would know when the process starts. So knowing it's coming to Brazil, I would only recommend to the Brazilian friends, you get prepared because it's sooner than you think end of this year that India will pass it over to you. And then you want to make sure you are in the right networks and so on. That's when you're in the particular country. If you're not in the country, then you want to watch out for, at one point, Indian G20, the Indian T20 hosts will set up a website on which they will call for papers, which gives you the opportunity then to submit your paper idea and hopefully get selected to produce a policy paper. And this is not limited to G20 member countries. Any think tank in the world can submit their ideas. It doesn't need to be from a G20 country. So watch out, put yourself on a mailing list as soon as there is a notification that there is a mailing list, make sure you are included. You have to reach out yourself in order to get that information, and then you make sure you submit your paper. I can assure everyone on the T20 process, proposals are highly sought after. If you have profound analysis on something, it is really the desire of the organizers to get quality proposals. So don't hold back, engage and submit your ideas.
Wonderful. Thank you for those ideas as well. And so now we are coming close to the end of our time. And just one final question. Where can our listeners learn more about CIPS's work and perhaps follow CIPS on social media? And are there any other resources to highlight?
Absolutely. Thank you, Adam, for bringing that up. Of course, we would love you to have a look at the papers that we produce. We have everything in English and also in Bahasa Indonesia. So if you want to find us, you go to the internet and you check www.cips-indonesia.org, www.cips-indonesia.org. And once you get to their website, You'll find the links to all our social media channels. You find the list of our publications. We have a newsletter every month that shares interesting perspectives. You'll find everything on that website.
Wonderful. Well, I know there's a lot of great analysis that CIPS is doing, and I'm thankful to have you here with us today to tell us more about your experiences with the T20 and the G20. We'll be sure to post the links on our podcast as well so that our listeners can learn more. And once again, many thanks for your time. It has truly been a pleasure, and we look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Listen and subscribe to CIPE's Democracy That Delivers wherever you get your podcasts.